There are many legends as to the origins of the name Lutsk. Some say of a certain Luka who founded the city. Others refer to the river Styr, which seems to close the field near the city. Although the most probable is the version which refers to the Slavic tribe of Luchan who used to live in these lands. The country. The history of the Ukrainian lands. Volhynia, Episode 1. In times of princes, the city was named Luchask or similar to that. Only during the Lithuanian rule, the city name became what it is now. Existence of Lutsk is first mentioned in a Byzantine chronicle of the 10th century. Długosz, the Polish historian of the 15th century, mentions a castle built in Lutsk by Volodymyr the Great in the year 1000. Our local chronicles first mention Lutsk in 1085, when Yaropolk, Prince of Volodymyr Volyn, fought with Vsevolod of Kiev and escaped to Poland, leaving his family in Lutsk. Prince Vsevolod sent Volodymyr Monomach to Lutsk, who took the city along with Yaropolk's wife, his army, and all the estate. In that time, Lutsk did not have its own princes, and it was subordinate to Kievan Principality along with all Volyn. The first prince was named David Sviatoslavich, although he did not last for long. In 1097, a conflict arose between him and the Prince of David of Volodymyr, where the latter, aided by Polovchans, took Lutsk away from David Sviatoslavich. In 1149, Lutsk reappears on the pages of history when Prince Yuri of Suzdal defeated Iziaslav Mstislavich and took away his Kievan Principality. Afterwards, the Prince of Suzdal marched to Volyn. His main objective was to capture Lutsk. The siege lasted for 6 weeks. Under leadership of Volodymyr, brothers of Iziaslav, the city folks fought bravely. Clouds of arrows and stones attacked the enemy armies from the city walls. Andriy, son of Yuri of Suzdal, nearly died in that battle. The folk surrounded him from all sides and he narrowly escaped death. His horse carried him out of the heat before collapsing. Andriy buried him near Styr River. The city withstood the siege, but Prince Yuri still hoped to seize it one day. In 1154, when Mstislav Izaslavovich, father of Roman the Great, was prince in Lutsk, the city was again surrounded by Princes Yaroslav of Galich and Volodymyr of Volodymyr. During the siege, Prince Mstislav went to search for help, entrusting the city defense to his brother Yaroslav. The latter was successful. Next year, Mstislav became the Prince of Volodymyr and left Lutsk in the hands of Yaroslav. Yaroslav was the first landlord of Lutsk. He ruled the city for a long time and paid close attention to culture and religion. He built churches and schools. The city grew and developed under his command. The chronicles mention the city as the Great Luchask on Styr, which proves the significant size of the second greatest Volhynian city after Volodymyr. The castle of Lutsk princes, which stood on the place of the modern Lubat castle, was obviously well fortified. The city itself had a lot of stone houses. Numerous churches and temples testify wealth and grandeur of the princely city. Some chronicles tell of more than 20 of them.
Перекази кажуть, що разом з монастирями їх нараховувалось більше 20.
When Yaroslav died, Lutsk Principality was divided into 4 parts. Vsevolod got Lutsk, Ingvar got Dorogobush, Mstislav the Mute got Peresopnitsa, while Iziaslav got Shumsk. Ingvar ruled in Lutsk after Vsevolod, followed by Mstislav the Mute, who prior to his death in 1225 entrusted his lands and his son to Danilo of Halych. As Prince Ivan died in 1227, Lutsk was for a short time captured by Prince Yaroslav Ingvarovich. As the chronicles say, the same year as Yaroslav ruled in Lutsk, Danilo was on his way to Zhidachin to pay homage to Saint Mikola. In Zhidachin, Danilo made boyars from Lutsk who expressed their insatisfaction with Yaroslav and asked him to take Lutsk under his rule. Having gathered his warriors, Danilo came to Lutsk. The city opened its gates to him and Danilo joined it to the lands of his brother, Vasil of Volodymyr. Since that time until 1271, Lutsk never had its own princes. We don't know what happened to Lutsk after the Tatar attack in 1240. The Tatars left descriptions of the city in later years. In the winter of 1259, Kuremza surrounded Lutsk, and the city was saved only due to its favorable location. Despite unapproachable high water, Kuremza still tried to capture the city. But the nature was against him. The storm broke his catapults, and Kuremza was forced to retreat into the steppes.
Сильна буря зламала прилади для кидання каміння, і Куремсі довелось вертатися в степ.
A new Tatar ringleader, Volhynia, came to Volhynia a few years later and ordered Vasil to destroy several castles, including the one in Lutsk. Vasil obeyed this order. After the death of Volodymyr, son of Vasil, in 1289, the Volodymyr Principality was under Mstislav of Lutsk. The city again had no princes of its own. After the death of Yuri I, Prince of Volodymyr, in 1308, the principality went to his younger son, Leo, who died around 1323. He was the last Ukrainian prince of Lutsk. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the 15th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. Yaroslav, brother of Mstislav and uncle of Roman the Great, was the first landlord of Lutsk. He ruled the city for a long time and paid close attention to culture and religion. He built churches and schools. The city grew and developed under his command that lasted over the period from 1155 through 1180. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Volhynia, Episode 2. When Yaroslav died, Lutsk Principality was divided into 4 parts. Vsevolod got Lutsk, Ingvar got Dorogobuj, Mstislav the Mute got Peresopnitsa, while Izyaslav got Shumsk. Ingvar ruled in Lutsk after Vsevolod, followed by Mstislav the Mute, who prior to his death in 1225 entrusted his lands and his son to Danilo of Halych. As Prince Ivan died in 1227, Lutsk was for a short period of time captured by Prince Yaroslav Ingvarovich. As the chronicles say, the same year as Yaroslav ruled in Lutsk, Danilo was on his way to Zhidichin to pay homage to Saint Mikola. In Zhidichin, Danilo met boyars from Lutsk who expressed their dissatisfaction with Yaroslav and asked him to take Lutsk under his rule. Having gathered his warriors, Danilo came to Lutsk. The city opened its gates to him, and Danilo joined it to the lands of his brother, Vasil of Volodymyr. Since that time, until 1271, Lutsk never had its own princes. We don't know what happened to Lutsk after the Tatar attack in 1240. The Tatars left descriptions of the city in later years. In the winter of 1259, Kuremza surrounded Lutsk, and the city was saved only due to its favorable location. Despite unapproachable high water, Kuremza still tried to capture the city. But the nature was against him. The storm broke his catapults, and Kuremza was forced to retreat into the steppes. A new Tatar ringleader, Volhynia, came to Volhynia a few years later and ordered Vasil to destroy several castles, including the one in Lutsk. Vasil obeyed this order. After the death of Volodymyr, son of Vasil, in 1289, the Volodymyr Principality was under Mstislav of Lutsk. The city again had no princes of its own. After the death of Yuri I, Prince of Volodymyr, in 1308, the principality went to his younger son, Leo, who died around 1323. He was the last Ukrainian prince of Lutsk. After the death of Leo Yurievich, around 1323, the city, as the chronicles say, was in the hands of Lithuanian Prince Lubart. He took up Christianity and married Leo's daughter. Lutsk, the capital of Prince Lubart and all Volhynia, had finally pushed Volodymyr to a secondary place. Prince Lubart developed the city and, foreseeing the further struggle with Poland, erected a fortified castle in the middle of the 14th century, which partly remains until now. From the time of its emergence, the castle played an important part. In 1349, Polish King Kazimierz captured Halichina and later the whole Volhynia. Only Lutsk owed its independence to the strength of the castle. Moreover, from there, the next year, Lubac began a counteroffensive, eventually restoring Volhynia under his rule. The struggle between Kazimierz and Lubac lasted until the death of the Polish king. In 1366, Lubac and his army reached Lublin, and with rich trophies returned to Lutsk. Lubac wasn't an alien to the Ukrainian population. He dedicated all his life to protection of his land. He was supported not less than the Ukrainian princes of the dynasties of Mstislav, Roman, or Danilo. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Inter TV channel dedicated to the 15th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. After Lubacz died around 1384, his place was taken by his son Fedor. But in 1387, following the Polish-Lithuanian Union, Polish King Jogaila deposed Fedor and passed Volhynia to Witold, the great Lithuanian prince. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Volhynia, Episode 3. Under Witold's rule, Lutsk became the second Lithuanian capital after Vilna. Witold reinforced the castle and took great care of the city. Being a Catholic, he built a Dominican monastery together with Jogaila, as well as a Catholic cathedral of the Holy Trinity. In 1428, he moved the cathedral from Volodymyr to Lutsk. At the same time, he never forgot about Ukrainian people. He built churches, and in 1427 he received a charter from Jogaila, which protected religious rights of the local people. In 1432, Jogaila gave Lutsk the right of Magdeburg. During all his life, Witold sought to break the Polish-Lithuanian Union. The struggle took many forms and reached its peak on the famous gathering of monarchs in Lutsk, the biggest European diplomatic summit. It began in January 1429, lasting for 7 weeks. The summit was initiated by Jogaila and attended by German Emperor Sigismund, Witold and his lords, Moscow Prince Vasil, and Metropolitan Priest Foti, great masters of Teutonic and Livonic orders of Crusaders, Danish King Eric XIV, representative of Byzantine Emperor Ivan Palaiologos, Hans of Tatars and Perikop, and others. The guests arrived in Lutsk accompanied by their guards and servants, in total about 15,000 men and women. All the outskirts of Lutsk were taken by participants, who rather enjoyed themselves than held council. Lithuanian chronicler Strykovsky wrote that the guests' daily diet includes 700 bulls, 1,400 rams, 100 bisons and elks, 700 barrels of mead, wine and beer. All those banquets laid a heavy burden on peasants. Each day transports with grain, wine and hunted game traveled along Volhynian roads. Despite the protests of Polish kings, the question of crowning Witold was settled. Jogaila, pressed by Sigismund, also agreed to crown the Lithuanian prince. Although the sudden death of Witold in 1430 cancelled Lithuanian plans for independence. Lithuanian Prince Svidrigaila succeeded the principality as elected by Ukrainian and Lithuanian lords. He continued to protect Ukrainian folks as their true ally. In 1431, a conflict around Podila arose between Svidrigaila and Poland, resulting in a war. On July 31st, the first serious battle took place at Styr. Prince Svidrigaila was forced to retreat, although Lutsk continued to defend itself desperately. The Poles burned the city and shot at the city from their mighty war machines. Although the Lutsk warlord, Yusha, with his 4,000 warriors, fought off all the attacks during a month. 5 Dominican monks were executed during the siege after their exposure as Jogaila's spies. The long and fruitless siege of Lutsk led the general dissent among the Poles. Horses died of prolonged heat. Jogaila was forced to sign a 2-year truce in 1431. Besides the Poles, Prince Svidrigaila had another adversary, the Lithuanian Prince Žygimantas, who captured his crown in 1432 and attempted to capture Volhynia. The two princes continually fought, with Poles intervening from time to time. Finally, the lords of Lutsk, seeing Svidrigaila's unfortunate disposition, chose in favor of Lithuanian rule. Next year, Žygimantas was killed, and Svidrigaila, who was hiding in Hungary for a year, returned to Volhynia. Lutsk cheerfully met its favorite prince. Having restored his rule in Lutsk, Svidrigaila entitled himself the Great Prince. Although prior to his death on February 10, 1452, he passed the keys to the city to the local elder Nemira and Princes Mihailo and Ivan Czartoryski, ordering them to give Lutsk over to Lithuania. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Inter TV channel dedicated to the 15th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. After Svidrigaila's death, Lutsk had no princess of its own. The city was ruled by Volhynian artisans, and beginning from 1475, by marshals of Ukrainian lands, who could only be of the Ukrainian origin. Lutsk began to decline. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Volhynia, Episode 4. The decline was mostly caused by attacks of Tatars. In spring of 1453, the Tatars destroyed part of the city, taking a few thousand prisoners. In 1491, the city was almost utterly destroyed by Tatars and fire. This forced Lithuanian Prince Alexander to grant Lutsk the right of Magdeburg once more in 1497. This charter, written in Latin, obliged the city folks to defend the city walls and the castle in case of danger. Numerous problems did not let the city rise. In 1508, warlord Luka Murovets fought off a large attack of Tatars. In 1540, Lutsk again suffered from fire, which destroyed all the old documents in the castle. Considering the city's decline, King Sigismund August, in 1552, made the citizens free from paying taxes. Within some period of stability, in the second half of the 16th century, Lutsk rebuilds its former glory. Trade and arts flourish in the city. In addition to usual artisans, the city also had goldsmiths, fur dressers, plumbers, sword masters, and stonemasons. Lutsk became the place of large fairs, where people sold leather, fabric, gold, jewelry, and wine. The population was comprised mostly of Ukrainians, who lived along with Armenians, Lithuanians, Jewish, Karaim's, Tatars, and Polish. The island was inhabited only by Christian population. Further down towards the temple, the people were of different faiths. Jews lived near Zhidichev, while Karaims lived near Omelianik. The entire city, except Yarovitsa, was surrounded by an embankment and a palisade with several towers. The city castle was founded by Lubert in the mid-14th century. The construction lasted quite for a long time, finished by Witold and Svidrigaila. The castle consisted of upper and lower parts. The outer walls of the most important upper part remain to this day. The castle of Lubert, built of brick and stone in the ancient Crusader style, was the biggest and the strongest castle on Volhynia and the times of Lubert. The whole castle was encircled with moats, with a hoist bridge, which made it unassailable. However, frequent fires, sieges, and ignorance of Svidrigaila's successors led to destruction of its several parts. By the end of the 18th century, it was entirely ruined, and in the 19th century, the Russian government considered plans of its disassemblage. The upper castle walls were 10.5 meters high, surrounding a triangular yard 230 meters wide, with a tower in each angle. The main gate, Lubert's Tower, the Svidrigaila's Tower at the Styr River, both 28 meters high. The third tower, Vladicha, was only 13 meters high. Prince's living quarters used to stand once between the two main towers. Prince Czartoryski built a house on its place. The Ukrainian Cathedral of St. John the Divine stood in the middle since the 12th or 13th century. In the 14th century, Lubert erected a new cathedral there, partly destroyed by fire in 1781, and finally dismantled by the Russian government in 1840. A house of Lutskan lords used to stand near the cathedral. Now, only some remnants of the walls remain from the lower castle. At that time, in the 16th century, they went from Svidrigaila's tower, around the modern prison, then to the west around the church, and then returned back to the upper castle's tower of Lubot. The lower castle had 7 towers. They were dismantled in the first half of the 19th century along with the rest of the buildings. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the 15th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. After the Lublin Union of 1569, the whole of Volhynia was annexed to Poland. Lutsk had become part of Polish Volhynian province. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Volhynia, Episode 5. In the fall of 1595, Severin Nalivayko came closer to Lutsk. The intimidated Polish nobility did not even consider fighting back and agreed to pay a contribution. He did not agree, however, and plundered the outskirts. The Lublin Union brings the spread of Catholic Church in Volhynia. In 1604, on the invitation of Bishop Szyszkiewski, the Jesuits arrived to establish their schools in the city. In 1614, they also founded a Ukrainian school for a fair competition. However, the latter gained no popularity among the Ukrainians and was soon closed down due to lack of students. At the end of the 16th century, Lutsk begins to play an important role in the life of church. The Eastern Orthodox Bishopate was quite rich, owning 4 towns, 2 castles and 34 villages. Among the bishops of Lutsk and Ostrog, Kirill Terlecki was the most famous as one of the initiators of church union in Brest. In 1617, the Eastern Orthodox Brotherhood was finally established by joint efforts of Ukrainian nobles, the clergy and the townsfolk. Such famed people as Petro Mohyla, Hetman Ivan Vygotsky, and Marina Mazepa, future Hetman's mother, were members of the Brotherhood. In 1619, King Sigismund III issued a charter allowing to build a church, a hospital, and a hospice in the city. A year later, by a decree of a Patriarch of Jerusalem, Theophan, the Brotherhood was exempted from under bishop's jurisdiction. Kirill Lukaris, the Patriarch of Constantinople, confirmed this document and gave his blessings to the Brotherhood. Along with a hospital and a hospice, the Brotherhood also built a school where folks learned grammar, rhetoric, dialectic and arithmetic. The church subjects included reading, singing, Holy Scriptures, and the Holy Deeds. Those wanting to study at Brotherhood School had to study its regulations within 3 days and pay 4 groszy to the joint funds. The exemplary traditions and rapid circulation of knowledge in the school gave many remarkable personalities to the Ukrainian society. The Catholics who disliked the Brotherhood activities often hampered its work. Often brothers and monks complained at the military court about violent attacks on their church. So on May 24, 1634, students of the local Jesuit Collegium attacked the Eastern Orthodox monastery, beating the monks, teachers and students with sticks and stones. Even the handicapped in the hospice were not spared. The attackers plundered the church property and stole around 150 gold coins from the church fund. In the first half of the 17th century, the biggest part of Lutsk's population was Ukrainian. They built the majority in artisan workshops and local government. Ukrainian was the official language. Ivan Vygovsky, the future hetman, was the deputy governor of Lutsk during the early 40s of that century. The victorious march of Bogdan Khmelnytsky in 1648 included Lutsk. Colonel Kolotka captured the city left by the Polish army, killed many Jews and Polish nobles. Next year, angry folks from the outskirts attacked the city and ruined certain parts of it. The 17th and 18th centuries saw a slow decline of the city due to the frequent fires and epidemics, taking thousands of people. From the second half of the 18th century, the Ukrainian nobles went under the Polish influence. The government was mostly comprised of Poles, and Polish became the state language instead of Ukrainian. In 1771, Lutsk again suffered a terrible fire. The Greek Catholic cathedral burned within the castle, the Roman Catholic within the city, along with more than 400 buildings. Only 597 houses remained in the city by the end of the 18th century. Only 50 of them belonged to Christians, with the rest owned by Jews and Karaims. That period is aptly characterized by a popular saying, "That city is a sad sight, with water outside and pity inside." The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the 15th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. After the division of Poland in 1772-1795, Volhynia became part of the Russian Empire. Polish nobles retained most of their estates under the Russian rule. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Volhynia, Episode 6. Part of Polish nobles who resisted the Russian crown were sent to Siberia by Empress Catherine. During the rule of Emperor Pavel, most of them returned to their estates. Cultural and religious conflicts aggravated between the Poles and Ukrainians. Landlords Czartoryski, Sangurski, Sapigi, Lubomirsky and others were enemies of all things Ukrainian. Czartoryski, as a regional chief, established a gymnasium in Kremenets, which later became a lyceum and a base of Polish culture which had no state. The Lyceum of Kremenets gave Poland such prominent people as composer Mikhail Ogiński, mathematician Eduard Czech, botanist Wilibar Besar, writer Henryk Sienkiewicz, and others. Poles didn't lose hopes for restoration of Rzeczpospolita, considering Volhynia and Halychina Polish territories. In 1812, during Napoleon's campaign in Russia, most of the Polish nobility joined French army, hoping for Napoleon's help in restoration of the Polish state. The defeat of the French had ended those hopes. Poland, along with Volhynia, remained parts of the Russian Empire. The new division of Europe among the countries of the Entente, England, France and Russia, and the union of Germany with Austro-Hungary, signaled the beginning of World War I in 1914. One of the glorious moments of that war was the famous Brusilov breakthrough, which took place in 1916 on the territory of Volhynia. This operation is considered a battle which went far ahead the strategy and tactics of its time. A thoroughly and secretly prepared onslaught was a total surprise for the enemy. As it was decided on the Entente Conference in Chantilly, the Russian High Command had planned to begin the general offensive in the middle of June 1916. Armies of the Western Front had to deal the main blow from Molodechno to Vilna. The forces of the Northern Front had to force a supportive attack near Dvinsk, while the Northwestern Front attacked Lutsk. In May 1916, after the defeat of Italian army near Trentino, the Allied troops appealed to Russia to speed up the preparations of the offensive. Tsar Nikolai II decided to make the first move on the southwestern front 2 weeks earlier than it had been initially planned. According to the plans of the front's high command, instead of the traditional ram attack of all forces, Commander Brusilov had to block the enemy reserves with all available armies. The plan of onslaught, designed by a chief of artillery, General Hanjin, was rather new and paradoxical. Hanjin offered to cut artillery attacks to a short and powerful discharge, along with preparations of the onslaught on the whole length of the front line, instead of concentrating on the bulk, which is always easily detectable. Each commander was ordered to attack in the direction he preferred. With 4 advancing armies, he had 4 independent attacks. A sudden and unexpected artillery strike was followed by massive advance of infantry. No army ever restored to such a maneuver during the First World War, except the Russian and German armies. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the 15th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. In May 1916, before the famous Brusilov breakthrough on Volhynia, The southwestern front had gained advantage over the Austro-Hungarian armies, 578,000 soldiers against 448,000, as well as artillery, 1,700 cannons against 1,301. Nevertheless, the enemy still overweight them in heavy artillery, 168 cannons against 545 pieces. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Volhynia, Episode 7. The Austrian lines had 2 and somewhere 3 lines of defense. The first line usually was made of 3 fortifications, preceded by 16 lines of wire blocks. Support machine guns fired from concrete blindages. The second defense line lay on the distance of 5 to 7 kilometers from the first one, while the third lay 8 to 11 kilometers away. The simultaneous offensive of all armies was started on May 22nd after many days of artillery preparations. The 8th Army of Kaledin broke the front line in the 16th zone, the Lutsk breakthrough, and captured Lutsk on May the 5th. On May the 4th, Kaledin defeated the 4th Austro-Hungarian Army of Archduke Joseph Ferdinand von Habsburg and marched onwards 65 kilometers to the west. Having depleted the army reserves, Kaledin encountered a fierce resistance of German troops quickly relocated from France. Despite the German counterattacks, the 8th Army retained its positions in battle over the period from June 3 to June 22nd. On June 11th, the 3rd Western Army joined Brusila's forces. However, their joint effort to storm the river Stockhod and march towards Kovel was unsuccessful, because Germans managed to create solid lines of defense there. In the Central Front, the 11th Army, commanded by General Sakharov, and 7th Army, commanded by General Shcherbachev, drew the enemy a few dozen kilometers to the west, but were stopped by German counterattacks. The left-flanked 9th Army, led by General Lechinsky, broke the front on the 11-kilometer distance, defeated the army of General Pflanzer-Baltin, captured Chernivtsi on June the 5th, and liberated the whole Bukovina by June-July. The Russian army advanced on Volhynia with a speed 80 kilometers a day. The success of the operation was in many ways secured by Russian army's new tactics. A company of 4 platoons was divided into 2 parts. 3 platoons moved in the first chain, followed by another covering platoon. At the enemy fortifications, the chains joined together and stormed the enemy's lines. Machine guns and special company also held support fire. Artillery's firewall began the battle, followed by grenadiers or fort cleaners. They acted in small groups, armed with grenades, pistols, and knives. The firewall moved to the rear of the enemy while grenadiers captured the forts. With the enemy still in blindages, a single soldier could clear the territory of the entire company with a single grenade. However, it required a subtle tactic. Moving too soon, a grenadier would be caught in his own artillery's fire, which destroyed the wires or forced the enemy in the trenches. As a result of Brusila's breakthrough, the Austro-Hungarian army were soon worn out, that it could no longer act until the end of war. This onslaught helped the Allied forces because the enemy had to relocate 30 divisions of infantry and 3 cavalry divisions to the eastern front, stopping the advance on Italy and the French Verdun. Moreover, Romania joined the Entente armies after that breakthrough. But the Russian army's success led to enormous losses. The southwestern front alone lost about 497,000 men. Further operations and preparations for campaign of 1917 required additional recruits, totaling to 1,900,000 men and 215,000 horses. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the 15th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. After the February Revolution of 1917, Ukraine demanded self-government rights from Petrograd. Provisional government was formed in Kiev, the Central Rada. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Volhynia, Episode 8. Rada shouldn't be viewed as a nationalist power, since it gained support among Russian intellectuals and former military officers. In October 1917, Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd and Moscow. The Bolshevik government, Council of People's Deputies, issued an ultimatum to the Central Rada, obliging Ukraine to let Bolshevik armies pass through its territory towards the Don, to engage the White Army of General Kaledin, as well as to proclaim the Soviet power in Ukraine. Nevertheless, the Central Rada did not agree to that. In the early February 1918, the Bolsheviks began to advance towards Ukraine. Due to the indecisive policy of the Central Rada and ineffective formation of armed forces, there was almost no one to defend Kiev from the army of Muravyev. 300 young volunteers cut the Bolsheviks' armies near Kruty and were destroyed there. The Central Rada first moved to Zhytomyr and then to Sarny, north of Volhynia. Bolsheviks began to advance on Volhynia, and the Central Rada was forced to ask for help with its former enemies, the Germans. This led to refusal of the countries of Entente to recognize Ukraine's independence. Unlike them, Germany, Austria, Turkey and Bulgaria recognized Ukraine's independence as well as its right to retain Volhynia, Holm and Podlachia. The first Ukrainian Blue Jackets division was formed, which joined forces with Germans and began advancing towards Kiev. On March 1, 1918, they captured the city. The Central Rada introduced new laws of land distribution among the peasants. Despite that, former landlords appealed to German forces to restore their land ownership. Eventually, German armies helped Russian and Polish landlords to regain their former estates in Volhynia and Podylia. Bolsheviks took advantage of dissent among peasants and began to rally them against the Central Rada. Rebellions broke out, but Germans suppressed them brutally. Ukrainian Hromada, a party of General Pavlo Skoropadsky, began widespread activity in those conditions. With the support of the German army, he was elected hetman of Ukraine on the General Landowners Meeting. Skoropadsky relied on Germans, although soon enough joined the Russian cause. Ukraine was surrounded by Bolsheviks in the north and the volunteer army of Denikin in the south, while Polish army, supported by the Entente, came to the west. The situation escalated towards the inevitable war. Everybody waited for German armies to leave Ukraine. At that time, leaders of the Ukrainian National Union, during a secret meeting, elected a directory with Simon Petlura at the head. They convinced Skoropadsky's forces to join their cause. On December the 4th, 1918, Skoropadsky had secretly renounced power and left Ukraine secretly on a German hospital train together with the German army. On December 18, 1918, the directory moved to Kiev. In March, however, the Bolsheviks began their onslaught on Ukraine. The directory government escaped first to Kamenets-Podilsky and later to Volhynia. At that time, the UPR was stabbed in the back by Poles who sought to restore Volhynia and Holm as parts of Poland. They had captured Lutsk, while the Red Army marched towards Proskurov, Shepetivka, Rivne, defeating the 19th Division of the Ukrainian Army. Surrounded by Poles and Bolsheviks, the directory's train rushed from station to station. The Bolsheviks joked, "Directory inside, territory outside." Although, the UPR found a way out of the situation. On June 5, 1919, Simon Petlura began advancing towards Starokonstantinov, Proskurov and Kamenets. His actions brought success, which allowed the armies of UPR to join forces with Ukrainian army of Halych. Their joint forces began to advance eastward. On August 13, 1919, they surrounded and captured Kiev. Nevertheless, on September 22, armies of General Denikin seized their onslaught on Moscow and began fighting against the UPR. They captured Kiev while Bolsheviks took advantage of retreating Ukrainian army and broke through to Zhytomyr. An army of 100,000 men led by General Haller began to fight on the Polish-Ukrainian front. The Ukrainian army was cornered from all sides and forced to retreat. Nearly 25,000 Ukrainian soldiers died of typhosis in the early 1920s. General Tarnovsky, who led Ukrainian army of Halych, made a truce with Denikin, and UPR terminated its fights against the Volunteers' army. In November 1919, The UPR ended up in the deadly triangle near Chotory. Bolsheviks advanced from the north, the White Guard from the south, and Polish army of Pilsudski from the west. The most of UPR government chose a lesser evil and joined the Poles. Simon Petlura escaped to Warsaw. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Inter TV channel dedicated to the 15th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. On April 22, 1920, Petlura and Pilsudski signed a peace treaty which handed Volhynia and Volhynia over to Poland as a payment for its help in fighting Bolsheviks and liberation of Ukraine. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Volhynia, Episode 9. At first, the Polish-Ukrainian troops advanced successfully. The 3rd Polish Army crushed the avant-garde detachments of Bolshevik Army, and together with the 6th Ukrainian Cossack Division of General Bezrучko, they captured Kiev on the 7th of May. However, on June the 10th, the Poles and Ukrainians were forced out of the city by the 1st Cavalry Army led by Semen Budyonny. Polish soldiers, alongside with the Ukrainian divisions of Petlura, retreated northward. Budyonny's cavalry reached Volhynia, broke the Polish front and headed towards Lviv. In July of 1920, the Red Army units of the Western Front, led by General Tuchachevsky, crushed the Polish army at Novgorod-Volhynsky, capturing Rivne, Dubno, Lutsk, Kovel, Volodymyr-Volhynsky, and then reached the Western Bug. Moving farther into Poland, Tuchachevsky reached Wisła and stopped at Warsaw, where the government already had begun evacuating most state institutions to Poznan. Although the Bolsheviks did not capture Warsaw, the Polish army rushed into counter-offensive and on September 13 took Volodymyr-Volhynsky, followed by Lutsk, Rivne, and the whole of Volhynia. Bolsheviks were driven away from Lviv while parts of UPR army had crossed the Dniester and engaged the Red Army detachments near Chortkovo and Pidgaytsi, throwing them behind the Zbruch River. Then suddenly the Polish army stopped near Konstantinov and Letichev. On October 18, the Polish High Command demanded from Ukrainian troops to also stop military actions against the Red Army. It happened when the 14th Bolshevik Army was defeated and the road to Kiev lay virtually open. Despite the Polish demands, Ukrainian troops continued to fight. At that time, the Poles were offered beneficial peace conditions by Bolsheviks. Poland neglected Ukrainian interests, and on November 9, Pilsudski signed a peace treaty with Bolsheviks, reinforced later by the Riga Treaty. For the second time in its history, Volhynia and Volhynia were handed over to Poland. The Ukrainian cause was lost. Outnumbered and outgunned, Ukrainian divisions did not stand a chance against the Red Army. On November 21, they crossed the river Zbruch to Volhynia, now Polish territory. They were encountered by Polish friends who disarmed them and sent to prisoner camps. The final borders were established along the line of Kherson, whereas Volhynia and Volhynia remained part of Poland. Eventually, the Polish province of Volhynia was formed, which included modern-time regions of Volhynia and Rivne, as well as Kremenets and Shum of the Ternopil district. At the late 20s, Poland saw a time of political crisis which reached its peak during the summer of 1930, when the so-called sanitation dictatorship of Józef Pilsudski led to emergence of legal political opposition. The newly formed Ukrainian Nationalist Organization took advantage of this crisis and organized active resistance to the Polish rule. More than 2,000 sabotage acts took place in June and July under UNO initiative, arsons and attacks at the state institutions in eastern Volhynia and Volhynia. The Polish authorities were determined to deal a mighty blow to the Polish opposition as well as the Ukrainian national movement. During the council, Pilsudski decreed to disband the parliament, arrest the most active members of the opposition, and launch new elections in November. The Ukrainian deputies were held under house arrest in order to prevent them from taking part in the elections. Their electorate was terrorized and forced to vote for Polish candidates. The political opposition was contained in the prison camp Bereza Kartutska. Due to numerous complaints to the League of Nations, the fate of the Ukrainian minority in Poland turned into an international scandal. However, while European and especially British politicians condemned the Poles, the League of Nations committee blamed Ukrainian ultra-wings for provoking the repressive actions. The Polish government quickly suppressed the turmoil, but these actions not only instigated more extremist actions from the Ukrainian side, but also severely complicated the search for a way out of the crisis. On September 1, 1939, Germany attacked Poland. On September 17, the Soviet army entered the territory of Volhynia and Volyn, annexing them to the Soviet Union. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the 15th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. On June 25, 1941, German troops occupied Lutsk. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands. Volyn, Episode 10. On June 23, in the wake of the retreat, all the prisoners contained in Lutsk prison were executed by the Soviet soldiers. We only know the numbers reported by Germans. They mention from 1,000 to 1,200 Ukrainians shot in Lutsk, and around 200 in Rudki and Komarne, as well as 30 killed in Berezhny. Armed detachments of the Ukrainian insurgent army began military activity on the territories occupied by Germans. Volyn became UIA's main area of operation. At the same time, several partisan detachments were subordinate to the Red Army, and namely the regiment of Sidirkovpak. Polish government and British immigration attempted to create military and political conditions to restore Polish rule in Volhynia, Volyn, Polisia, and Holm. Until 1939, these lands had been part of Poland. In September 1939, however, they were annexed to the Soviet Union by Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, although many Poles still resided there. On February 23, 1943, after the defeat of German troops at Stalingrad, Polish government made a statement condemning the annexation of Western Belarusian lands to Belarus and Ukraine. The detachments of Armia Krajowa were established in Volyn. So the Volhynian forests had become area of operations for Red partisans, Armia Krajowa, and various UIA forces, detachments of Taras Bulba-Borovets, Bandera and Melnik. For some time, the Red partisans and UIA warriors had been almost allies. Ukrainian patriots even led armies of Kovpak through Carpathian mountains. However, soon the Moscow directives and refusals of Ukrainians to reconcile with the questions of independence led to their eventual breakup. Death of General Vatutin on February 29, 1944, in an accidental shootout with the UIA near Milyatin of Ostrog district, laid the first brick in the open confrontation between the Red Army and the UIA. Armia Krajowa became another UIA's adversary, mostly due to the UIA's decree on land reform, which gave all the lands previously colonized by Poland in the hands of the Ukrainian peasants. Men of Bandera demanded to drive the Poles away from UIA territory because of constant hampering to the Ukrainian cause. In those conditions, any domestic misunderstanding could instigate a bloody fight. On July 12, 1943, a Polish detachment left from Bilin, a base of the 27th Division of Armia Krajowa, and moved towards the village of Pisareva Vola. Two small tanks and an aircraft kept firing at the village inhabitants. The village was set on fire. People fled to the forest while Poles stormed into the village and burned it completely. The same fate caught up with the villages Dubniki, Koti, Veriv, Puziv, Stanjarichi, and others. UIA detachments and peasants began to reply by destroying the Polish villages. One of the most tragic pages of Ukrainian-Polish history began, known as the Volyn Massacre. More than 20,000 Poles died by hands of Volhynians in July 1943. On July 11 and 12 alone, 12,000 men died. According to some sources that cannot be verified, Ukrainians committed 110 assaults, in each of which from 50 to 100 people died, 25 assaults that brought to death 200 people, and 15 assaults that killed over 300 people. All this bloodshed happened on the territory occupied by Germans and served them as an entertainment. Vice Chancellor of Ukraine Erich Koch said, "I want a Pole to kill any Ukrainian he meets, and vice versa. If they kill a Jew too, that's a cause for celebration." Although there were areas free of occupants. In May 1943, the UAA detachments proclaimed People's Republic in the liberated villages of Volhynia and Rivne districts from the Pripyat River to the Gorin River, while the towns of Kolki became its capital. A military regime was established. The village and district councils provided the government. Political affairs were managed by Yuri Shevchenko, nicknamed the Sailor. Administrative and economic institutions were also established. There were 2 windmills, a bakery, 2 diners, 2 bathhouses, a milkery, and a hotel. Ukrainian service were performed in a local church. The renovated power station provided light to local schools, hospitals, and the print house. It sounds unbelievable, but the Kolki Republic existed for 5 months and was destroyed by Germans only in October 43, with the help of tanks, aircraft, and artillery. In the middle of May, the UAA had blocked the Bolshevik forces in the Black Forest at a front of 50 kilometers. In the decisive battle of July 1st, 1944, the Red Partisans were almost totally exterminated. In spring, the UAA created a battlefront on the northwestern Polish border, fighting the advancing detachments of Armia Krajova near Lubachev, Ravaruska, and Hrubyshev. On July 9, 1944, 2 German divisions were also engaged in those battles, trying to destroy UAA republics in Dolinshina and Skilshina. Suffering severe losses, Germans left the mountains by July 16th. After the war, Polish border lay along the western Bug River. Holm district was annexed to Poland and UAA forces were divided in 2. They carried on resisting the Soviet power, but in the 50s, the rest of UAA deported secretly through Czechoslovakia to the west. The last fight of the UAA with the Soviet militia is dated 1961. The country, the history of the Ukrainian lands.